guys, it's Sam, and today I'm going to talk about my all-time favorite villains in fiction. So I did this video, I think in like 2014, 2015 as a Top 5 Wednesday topic, and I've never revisited this since then. I know that I talked about a lot of these villains in that video as well, but I want to do kind of a comprehensive video because I feel like more people will see this and they saw the old one. So I want to kind of talk about all of them, and these are my favorite villains. Now, when I was going through my list of all the books that I've read, because I went on Goodreads and did that, there were some villains that I still liked, but these were the villains that, like, when I saw the book on my read list, I was like, those villains were great. I remember their names, all of that. So there's some villains that I'm not mentioning on here that are still good, but these are like top tier villains for me. Also, I'm just not going to be talking about some of the very popular pop culture villains because I feel like those are so well known. Like, a lot of these are well known too, but as far as like, I'm not talking about Umbridge or Voldemort or like President Snow, like some of those really main ones, because I feel like everyone knows those are good, you know, like we don't need to really like go over that and why they're good and like all of that. So I'm not really talking about those. Those are not going to be in this video, but they're still good. Like, they're still really great villains, but like they're so pervasive throughout pop culture that like I don't need to mention them. This also was my Patreon video pick for the month, so every month my Patreon supporters get to vote in a poll for a video topic that I will do that month. They also get to vote in polls for books that I'll read. We have a monthly live show, we have a Discord group, we have a lot going on Patreon, so I will link that on the screen if you want to get involved in that. And these aren't really in any particular order. I'm going to talk about like my most favorite last, but generally speaking, like I'm kind of talking about my most favorites later on in the video, but like all of these are my favorites. They're all so good, and you will notice a theme in here, which we'll get to. So the first villain I want to talk about is Maddock from The Cruel Prince. Maddock is our main character's stepfather, and he is a fairy. This takes place in the Fey world, and he actually killed the main character's mom, who was his former lover at the very beginning. That's not a spoiler or anything. And he's been raising the human children in fairyland. And he's a war general. He's from a race of fairies that are very like warmongering and really like violence, and they're called redcaps, and they dip their hats in all of their kills' blood and all this stuff. But he's a very interesting villain because he's not necessarily even the main villain in the story. There's lots of different villains in here, but I liked the most out of all the kind of antagonists in here because of the really interesting dynamic between him and Jude, the main character, because he is this father figure, but he literally killed her real parents, and he has taught her a lot about how to survive in this world and how to be sort of this like villainous character, because she has these moments where she's not necessarily like a good person. Like, no one's a good person in this series. So he's taught her a lot, and she is really like her father's daughter in that she takes after him, but he's not her dad. And there's just a lot of really interesting dynamics with them. I don't think that he was used as well in the final book, and I've talked about that, so I'll link that review on the screen if you're interested in my thoughts. So he wasn't as great as he could have been, but I really enjoyed the dynamic with him. Next we have Eli from Vicious by Victoria Schwab, and really only Vicious because I'm not considering the rest of the books in the series to be a thing, even though he's in those too. But what I liked about Eli is we have two characters really who are villains in this series. Both Victor and Eli are villains, but we're pulling for Victor because he is our protagonist. And what's so compelling about Eli is I just hated him. Like, there's not every villain do I like hate in this way, but I'm just like, oh, I don't like you, because he is that like religious zealot. He becomes sort of a religious zealot in a way in this, and those kinds of characters just like boil my blood. And so he was that, and he thought that he was superior as this, like, they're not mutants, but basically like mutants. He thought his powers were superior and he needed to wipe out the rest of them, and I'm just like, I hate this kind of villain because they're so realistic, you know, like the things that he thinks and the way that he behaves on a much grander scale than what we have as like real life villains, although some villains are like that. So he was just so grounded in realism in that way for a fantastical type world that every time I had chapters with him, I'm like, I hate you, but you're so interesting, but I hate you. So those are some of my favorite villains. In a similar vein, we have Harathan, I think is his name, from Elantras. He is a high priest in this world, and he's coming to kind of like convert the people, and he has a really interesting dynamic with the main characters as well, particularly the female character in here, because he sort of reminds me of another really good villain, the priest, judge, whatever he ends up being in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, like the Disney movie, but also like the real story. I've just never read the real one, because he's so like, because he's like creepy and like really, the song Hellfire for Disney villain songs is like actually terrifying. So he's that kind of character where like not quite as extreme as that dude, but he is very like drawn to and intrigued by the protagonist, and he always like feels very conflicted because of that, and I always find those kinds of dynamics to be really interesting. And you do get his POV in the story as well, so that's an interesting thing. Like he's going up, he's more of an antagonist, he's going up against our protagonists, and he's doing it for what he thinks are the right reasons. They're like religious based, but like he just, the dynamic that they have is just really interesting. Then we have Aiden from Illuminae, and really only from Illuminae. He's a character in the rest of the books as well, but Illuminae is the only one of the series that I really love. Anyway, Aiden is an AI that's attached to the ship. This is a sci-fi story, and I really enjoy like villainous AI, and because AI don't run under the same like moral codes as we do, and they're programmed to be a certain way, and that always is very hard, because then you have like the whole like, are they human, well, not like human, but are they like, they're learning our morals, but they also have their own coding, and like they have their one sort of mission that is above everything else, and so they do these villainous things, but it's like for the right reason, and I just find that really compelling. So Aiden as an AI character that's a villain, anti-villain kind of character, I really enjoy. Next we have the woods from Uprooted. I have talked about magical woods in a video, so I will link that video on the screen as far as something that I really love, but the magical woods in Uprooted is like the main villain, and the story behind it, which I can't get into because spoiler territory, I just find really compelling and really interesting, and I just really enjoy magical woods that are trying to fuck everyone up, because I just really like the idea of like nature and nature magic like taking back what's theirs and like taking revenge on humans. Like I'm just like, it's justified, man. I go for it. Next, I really enjoy all of the villains in the Book of the Ancestor series by Mark Lawrence. I'm not going to go through all their names, but really all of these villains are so interesting because they are those like love to hate villains. Like you just hate them. And then also like it's really satisfying when villains do get taken down in this series, because they get taken down in like really satisfying ways. So I feel like this one is similar to Nevernight. I mean, I just finished the Nevernight series. Those villains are not on this list because I didn't find them quite as compelling at times. I don't know, like I do and I don't. So I think that the villains in Book of the Ancestor are even more loathsome than Nevernight, and I just really enjoy the way that they get like taken down as well. So very satisfying for villains, and they're all just like power hungry creeps. Next we have Thaygam from the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. He really starts popping up in book 2. This is a character that is sort of like an archetype of a villain, where it's like he's beloved as like a soldier type character, but he's awful, and he is an actual rapist, and he's just awful and manipulative and just uses his power and his strength against everybody and is just like the worst. Like I just, again, another character that like I hated every scene. He just made my skin crawl, but that is showing how good of a villain he is. Next we have the virus in the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. This is a science fiction series, and this is like an alien virus that turns people into like disgusting zombies and is just so like insidious. But as the series goes on, this isn't really like a spoiler because it's pretty obvious right away, you sort of learn that it's like a sentient virus. So it's just like, and it really reminds me of like the Reapers in Mass Effect and like the Reaper stuff, because Reapers in Mass Effect like turn people into Reapers, and it's that similar vibe. And also there's like creatures in Mass Effect that are called husks that are very similar to the zombies in here, and I just really like that idea because it's so creepy, right? It's just like, so because it's like a virus, which like is really creepy right now obviously, but it's like a sentient virus that's like alien, and you can like, it can change things, and it's just like, oh, it's so gross. So this is a really like creepy thing because it's something that, you know, you can't quite fight it at this point. Like I've only read the first 2 books, so I don't know how like what they do against this virus as things go on, but it's not that same, like it's not a personification as we're learning currently in life. You can't fight a virus. It's not a person. It doesn't care. It doesn't have feelings against you, although like this might because it's sentient, but you know, it's so interesting. And so, creepy. Then we have the Lord Ruler from the Mistborn First Era by Brandon Sanderson, and this is the main villain within this book, but then it kind of changes a bit around as the series goes on, but this character is still like present in a way, and is like a through line throughout the first era. And what I find really interesting about this particular villain too is like what you learn about him throughout the rest of the series. When you first see him, you're like, okay, this is a very typical like evil emperor ruler type character, but as things go on, you learn a lot more about him and how he got to where he was in a way that's really interesting, because it's not like, I don't like when you learn those kinds of things outside of the story, like in novellas and stuff. It's like part of the series, so I find him super intriguing as well. Next we have the Red Queen from the Queen of the Tierling by Erica Johansson. I have not read the final book yet, but I will probably next month. And this is a fantasy series, and the Red Queen is the antagonist villain that we don't really get to see a lot of. I mean, she's definitely present, but she is definitely going up against our main character, who is newly the queen of this kingdom. You know, she was kept in sort of like seclusion for a long time, and now she's coming back and she's discovering that there's this other queen who is her opposite that's trying to go through her borders and do all this bad stuff, and has a sort of like dark magic thing, but they are each other's mirrors, which I find really cool. Like, I like that kind of dynamic and villain dynamics where they are like drawn to each other, sort of like a like calls to like situation, which I'll bring up later. Just seeing themselves in each other, I find that kind of relationship between the main characters and the villains really interesting. Speaking of relationships between main characters and villains, we have Corian from the Imperium trilogy by Claire the Grand. I'm reading the second book right now as I'm filming this video, actually. This is a character I've actually talked about before in a video that I made about villain main character dynamics tropes, so I will link that on the screen, because if you like this video, you're probably going to like that one, because I talk a lot about some of these villains and how they have these really interesting dynamics with the main characters, which is something that I really like, as you've noticed as I've talked about them. But this is a fantasy story that follows two characters in two different timelines, 1,000 years apart, but Corian is still the main villain in both because he's an evil angel. But angels in a way that, like, this is a different kind of angel than the angels that you see in a lot of like angel fiction and stuff like that. So he's really compelling because the dynamic that he has with both of the main characters is super interesting, and he's like creepy, but he's like the seductive creepy. So that just makes him like even more interesting. Like, if you're into villain main character ships, you'll probably like what this is giving you. I'm not saying that there's necessarily a relationship, but like the dynamic and the pull that these characters have is just very compelling, and he's sort of like that character, you know, like the devil on their shoulder trying to like whisper them over to the dark side, and it's like very compelling because he's just such a compelling character. So I really enjoy him, and I'm really enjoying him also in the second book right now that I'm reading. Then we have the Kings in the 12 Kings in Shirakai by Bradley Baleo. This is a adult fantasy series, and the villains are all these kings that our main character is trying to take down because of what they did to her family. It's like a vengeance quest thing. But they all have these magical abilities that were gifted to them. I'm forgetting if it's like by the gods or like some kind of magical ability, but they all have, it's sort of like a double-edged sword thing. The abilities sort of like do something bad to them as well, but they all have these different like godlike abilities, like they're almost made into gods, and it has really like taken away some of their humanity and everything, and what you learn about them and the things that they've done and why they did them and everything, like throughout even this first book, because this is the only one I've read and it's like a 5-book series, is really interesting. Like, I really enjoy them, and you do get some few chapters in their perspective. Like, it mostly follows our main character, but you do get flashes of like what they're doing, and that's also really interesting. So I just find them super compelling too, and I really like when a character has to take out like a group like this. Like, she's going for 12 different kings, and I just really like when it's like this progression of like, she killed this one and she killed this one. Like, it almost feels like a video game in that way, where it's like you're building your way up to like the final bosses that are like super powerful. So yeah, I just find them very intriguing, and I look forward to continuing this series because I haven't done that yet, and it's really interesting. Now we're getting into my top 5, which are like my, I mean, all of these are so good, but like these are like my favorites and have been for quite some time. So next we have the Komazar from the Remnant Chronicles. He pops up in book 2, and this is a character that's very similar and reminiscent of another character I'm going to talk about later that I know you guys know is coming. He's just this villain character that is doing really bad things, but he's doing them for like decent reasons. Like, he does care in his own way. Like, I like when villains are like this. They like care in their own way about like their people, particularly when they're like rulers, but they're letting the power and the vengeance and the anger that they have affect things so that their people are actually suffering more than anything else. But they like start out doing it, and their backstory like doing it for like a fairly understandable reason. Like, I really enjoy villains where I still hate them and I don't necessarily want them to be redeemed or anything, but that I'm like, okay, like I get how you like ended up down that path, you know? And he's definitely a character that I feel like that with. And then also I just like the dynamic between him and Leah in this book. Again, like I kind of mentioned with the tropes video that I mentioned before, I just enjoy, they have this like dynamic where I'm like, kiss. It's not a villain ship, but like they have that tension, and I just really enjoy that. Even if characters don't get together, like I don't necessarily always root for villain ships, but I really like villain tension, where like the villain kind of wants to kiss the main character and the main character kind of wants to kiss the villain. Like I'm kind of always there for that, you know? Then we have the villains from the Porson series by Garth Nix, specifically Sabriel because that's the one that I remember the most, but I really want to reread the last 2 books in that series because I haven't reread them since high school, but I've reread Sabriel like 3 times. But this is a like necromancer type series, and our main character is able to go into death to bind the dead. Like she goes into the river of the dead to bind the dead, to send them back from whence they came. And the things that come out of death in here are like super creepy. There is a character, like the main villain in this one, is like someone who used to be, I'm pretty sure they used to be like human, and then they've been like dead for a while, and now they're like real fucked up. And it's such an unsettling, terrifying villain. Like when this villain is coming out of death, you're just like, oh my god, you are so creepy. So I really enjoy these kinds of characters that are just so like scary, but scary in a way that I know that the like main character can like handle it, but like the villain in here, like I remember being like very nervous about when I first read it, and even on rereads I'm still just like chilled by the villain in here. Speaking of chilling villains, we have from the Graceling series King Lek. The Graceling series are all 3 companion books, and they take place in sort of like different times, but they have some overlap. All the characters kind of show up in each other's books, but they are taking place in different places in different times. And what's interesting about King Lek is he is sort of similar to the Lord Ruler, a through line through the whole series. He's not necessarily present in the whole series, or he is in different ways because again it's different timelines and stuff, but it's sort of like the ripple effect of a villain and the impact that they have on people throughout time, and these characters that are distant from each other that I find really compelling about him. Also, he's like a very kind of character the same way some of these other ones I've mentioned, where I'm just like, I hate you, you're so gross, your like powers and stuff are so like make me so uncomfortable. So he is a really cool villain just because of the way that he was present throughout the story and the way that Kristen Kishore molded him into the story in different ways. Top 2. Can you guess which the top 2 are going to be? If you think you can guess, comment below right now, like pause the video, and let me know which ones you think they're going to be. So we have the Bear from The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. Well, really, the whole Winter Night series, I feel like I grew to love this villain in the last book, which is The Winter of the Witch, which I read this year and is one of my favorite books of the year. He is such an interesting character. In book 1, I didn't think that I love him as much as I end up loving him by book 3. Like, he is a character that, again, is not quite your like typical villain. Like he is this mythical creature because this is based on Slavic folklore and mythology, so he is a folklore tale that's present in Slavic folklore, and he's so cool because he's like, he represents sort of life, sort of destruction, violence, chaos, and he's just a being that like wants to do that. And it's just very interesting because like as the series goes on and he pops up more often, you just kind of are like, you're made to do that, man. Like, he's supposed to be the balance, part of the balance in the world of, like, you have to have some of this stuff, and you have to have some of that stuff. Like, you have to have both. And his interactions and dynamics with the characters, especially in the last book, are so good. I encourage you to watch my review for the final book in the series if you've read this series at all, and I can just gush about it forever. I'll link it on the screen. But he's so compelling and interesting and cool. I just love him. Like, I can't stop smiling about him because he's one that I, like, genuinely love. Like, he's not a villain that I necessarily, like, hate. I hated him at points throughout the series, but, like, by the end, I, like, sort of loved him. And he doesn't necessarily become, like, a good character, you know? So, yeah, I really love the Bear from the Winter Night trilogy. And finally, you knew it was coming, so I don't need to talk about it a ton. We have the Darkling from the Grisha trilogy. Duh. He's just my like favorite OG villain. Like, I just adore everything about him because he combines so many of my favorite things, right, that I've talked about with some of these other villains. He has a very interesting dynamic with Alina, one that obviously some people ship, including myself, in another timeline where like she wants to embrace her dark side. He's doing the things that he does for like very misguided reasons. Like, you sort of understand how he got to where he got with things, and he really does want to sort of like help in his way, but like it's not helpful, and he does really awful things, things, but I'm kind of just like, let him be awful. And he's lived for so long, so like his sense of morality is so morphed, and he's just so interesting. Like I just love him. I love his like shadow abilities and everything. His abilities are really cool. Like he's just so compelling, and really it is the dynamic between him and Elena that just like gets me, because their interactions are so cool. The like calls to like, the like being sort of mirrors for each other. All of that is just so interesting. So I love him, and he's always going to be one of my favorites. I mean, he has also like some of the best lines, like the "make me your villain" and like all that stuff. Like, and there's two thrones on the, like there's so many things with him that I just really enjoy. So he's always going to be a favorite. So that is it for my all-time favorite villains so far, as of 2020, beginning of 2020. So comment down below, let me know some of your favorite villains. I can also do a video on my least favorite villains, because when I was going through the list, I definitely found villains that I thought were really lame. So let me know if you want to see that. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.